Now that's a serious fact.
Serious Sam Next Encounter has always been a mysterious game in the Serious Sam series. Previously, we knew very little about its creation, or how it came to be in the first place. What we do know is that it was developed by Climax Solent, released on the same day as an unrelated Game Boy Advance game by Climax London. Crow Team, the creators of Serious Sam, haven't said much about it since its creation. And yet, Next Encounter is regarded by many to be a great game in the series. Something remarkable is that its development coincides with Crow Team's own second encounter. See here, the design doc mentions a creation date of June 12, 2001. So ultimately, Next Encounter was being made when Serious Sam was still a brand new IP. The final game would end up being released in 2004, at which point Crow Team's full-fledged sequel Serious Sam 2 was on its way. Since then, we've found bits and pieces related to Next Encounter's development, which demonstrate a great deal of changes throughout the years. I don't intend to cover everything, but I'll go over what I consider to be the most interesting changes. Let's start with the plot. As it was released, Next Encounter focuses on an evil clone of Serious Sam who's been disrupting the timeline. There's a level late into the game called Syrian Mothership, of which the description implies you've only just discovered it. However, the original plot's focus was the Mothership, which Sam would have known about from the start of the game. Hence, the original title was actually Word to the Mothership instead of Next Encounter. Scientists have learned more about the infamous time lock technology and are now able to send teams back to locations of their choosing rather than preordained periods of time. The scientists notice strange signals emanating from ancient Rome, so they've sent 2 teams to investigate, who unfortunately failed to return. Further analysis lead to the conclusion that those signals were of Syrian origin. Serious Sam is called in to investigate. As it turns out, there's an abandoned mothership containing technologies that would give Mental's army a huge advantage in the takeover of Earth. Now Sam has to reach this mothership before they do. Funnily enough, this plot is what's summarized on the back of the retail box. The development of Next Encounter started with some extremely simple test maps in Crow Team's Sirius engine. It's unknown whether the plan was to develop the entire game here or not, but there are numerous screenshots of the game's maps inside Sirius Editor, so it seems many of them were initially designed here. Nonetheless, the final game uses an in-house engine from Climax, optimized specifically for the Nintendo GameCube. According to one of the project leads, the PlayStation 2 version was a late idea that was pushed by the publisher, and it was reportedly quite a headache for the crew. That would explain the significant visual downgrade. There are numerous mid-development videos of Next Encounter available on Andrew Borman's channel, who I'll credit this once, as a majority of what we have are from his contributions over the years. He's also given me some unique material that we've never seen before, so huge thanks and shout out to him. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. At some point in 2001 came a tech demo video that was never officially released. This shows off a few earlier environments with some time of day changes. Seems a lot of enemy models had already been made at this point, though some differences are noticeable. For example, the Atlanteans here are blue instead of the familiar orange. The following year, a trailer was made that was also never officially released. The levels have new lighting detail, which arguably looks better than the released game. And the HUD here resembles a cross between the first and second Encounter style. Around this time, there was a placeholder voice actor for Sam. You can hear him saying "Ole" many times in this one milestone video.
Ole! Ole!
We also have a single voice line regarding a scrapped item.
Smart bomb, dumb enemies. A beautiful combination.
More about that later. Andrew Borman mentions that there was once an optional third-person mode, similar to the PC originals. Perhaps this was reconsidered due to the limited controller buttons. A few screenshots indicate that earlier in development, the menus were very similar to the original Xbox port of the classic games. Near identical, actually. Speaking of, the Xbox port has another thing in common: the box artist. Daniel Lish designed both of these covers, which I confirmed by asking him directly. Alright, let's talk about NPCs and Enemies. Wildlife NPCs are something that's been considered since the very conception of Serious Sam. However, it rarely ends up happening. Next Encounter is yet another example of this, as wildlife was planned to roam in various environments. They would be benign and wouldn't attack the player, but would respond to gunfire and combat by running away. In development, Climax remodeled a variety of Serious Sam enemies in their own vision. The fate of most was to be reverted back to the classic models, however some remained unique, like the biomechs. As per usual in game development, a variety of sound effects were changed. Interestingly, you can hear the same kamikaze scream that would end up being used in Serious Sam Advance. The Legionnaire ants were once red and sounded like horses. Which is strange, because that same bizarre choice was made again for the arachnoids in, you guessed it, Serious Sam Advance. Insert that weird that it happened twice nickel analogy, especially considering these were two different divisions of the Climax studio. Remember marsh hoppers from the classics? These seem to be the original Dum-Dums before their creation. You can see them here in their 2002 trailer. Unlike their Serious Sam Classic counterpart, they had enough health to recoil backwards after being shot. They were also able to swipe at the player, as opposed to the classic version, which could only jump and explode. In the final game, Dum-Dums will always die in an explosion of green gibs, much like the classic marsh hopper. However, in development, they had more than one death animation. You can see a brief clip of this here. Remember that one cutscene that shows a single-leg Dum-Dum approaching Sam? This was actually its own variant in development, as you can see in this old screenshot. I imagine it posed so little of a threat that there was basically no need to keep it around. In the design document, responsible for the other half of information in this script, it mentions that kamikazes had an animation for recoiling backwards. This is possible in the classic games, but not in the released Next Encounter for whatever reason. There was once a metallic, or perhaps shielded, clear at one point. You can see one in the game's concept art, and we have a few screenshots. Nobody's sure what differences it had, but a similar enemy was also planned for Serious Sam 2. In that proto-version, metallic clears could resurrect unless they were blown to bits. In the case of Next Encounter, it's not certain whether this was a variant of clear, or just Climax's unique interpretation of the creature. There was once an enemy called the Wasp which resembled a yellow jacket. They were once present on almost every level, but scrapped entirely before release. According to a developer interview, they were, quote, a sucky enemy, we nixed them, end quote. Their behavior, observed from prototype videos, is fairly similar to the final game's Tweedledum-Dum and Harpy enemies. If you thought stingers were scary, then get a load of this concept art where the wasps have attached machine guns. There's mention in the game's files of a tongue harpy, and we happen to have this concept art with a harpy that has a very long tongue. Maybe it deployed some kind of a whip attack. We have this one short animated gif of a rocket-launching zombie marine. Damn, this thing is creepy. Look at how its dislocated jaw moves. Not a single bit of humanity left, just a walking weapon in a human shell. Remember the Senator's Vineyards level? Initially, it was to introduce a new enemy called saber-clawed tigers. No information about them has ever been published, but I have a theory. Remember that baby wearable enemy that shows up in a single level? I think that's what these were initially. They do have this vaguely tiger-esque design. There was some kind of maggot enemy being worked on at some point. Doesn't seem like that went very far. The last thing I noted was how the cutting room floor page for Next Encounter mentions a second class of Legionnaire ants. Maybe that explains what we saw in the early trailer. Alright, time for the weapons. Next Encounter introduced alternate ammo types to the series, which can be traced back to its original design document. If you've seen Andrew Borman's early videos, you've likely noticed the Bone Masher Power Drill, which would eventually be replaced by a modified Second Encounter chainsaw. The Power Drill had 3 different modes: Standard, Burst, and Feather Duster. The Burst mode would fire in short bursts. I don't quite get the point of that, but this apparently did greater damage. The Feather Duster mode would only be usable after finding a secret Feather Duster pickup. You would then use it to tickle your enemies to death. In the final game, you get to wield a single deagle for just one level before it's forcibly dual-wielded. However, you could do both in earlier prototypes. Here's a neat one, the Pump-Action Blunderbuss. Interestingly, Serious Sam 2 was also to have a blunderbuss, but it was also scrapped. There was at one point going to be a crossbow. Here's an early concept for its firing animation. There was also a quad-barrel shotgun. Am I the only one noticing some bizarre similarities between Next Encounter and Serious Sam 2? The rocket launcher has an earlier model, as seen in older gameplay. Looks a bit like the minigun, doesn't it? According to some concept art, they had once planned to do a unique take on the Xbox rocket launcher, but eventually, they went with something much closer to the final Xbox model. Fun fact, the team behind the HD remake of Next Encounter, for all we know cancelled, at one point worked on replicating this original concept design. Earlier in development, Climax wanted to reuse Crow Team's laser gun design. This version would have 4 firing modes: single cannon, 4 cannon, attract beam, and repel beam. Attract would pull enemies towards a set of deployed blades. Repel would push enemies away, causing damage. Pretty ambitious stuff. In the end, the laser gun was replaced with the Syrian power gun, which once had a very different model and texture. This is that smart bomb that was briefly mentioned earlier. The smart bomb was a fixed plunger in certain levels that, when activated, would eliminate every enemy in the vicinity. The inclusion of the serious bomb is likely why this ended up being scrapped. Lastly, there was a planned weapon that would reprogram itself after absorbing enemy projectiles. This was eventually deemed too complicated to make, thus it ended up being scrapped. How cool would that have been, though? Let's talk about vehicles and power-ups. Here's an early look at the Jeep model, which doesn't have a roof. Interesting. In the original design document, it indeed had a roof. Speaking of, the design document says it once used tracking miniguns instead of the final's homing rockets. One vehicle that went entirely scrapped is the Sirius Hoverboat. We have this list of sound effects to verify it, as well as a mention in the design document. In terms of weaponry, the hoverboat would use tracking miniguns. There was going to be a jetpack to use in the game, but it ended up being removed for, quote, obvious reasons. Concept art shows scuba gear, something that was once planned for the original Serious Sam. We don't know anything about it in Next Encounter context. Maybe it was a power-up? Speaking of, a good few power-ups were scrapped before release. Serious Bubblegum is one of them, which would let Sam blow an enormous protective bubble around himself. Shots fired at Sam would rebound, however Sam would be able to shoot through the bubble. Serious Glasses. Any enemy within 10 meters after picking this up will die from laughter. Not sure if this was a short-term replacement for the power drill mode, or just another method of making enemies laugh. Ultimately, this entire effort would be downplayed into an extremely rare ammo type for the gas gun, which most players likely never used. Serious Underpants. Well, this was once the game's invulnerability power-up. Still exists in the final game, but as a golden model of Sam, akin to the classics. Now on to the levels. Many, if not most of the game's levels went through a name change late in development. I'm not about to list every change, but here's an old level list if you're curious. The PlayStation 2 version came with bonus deathmatch maps. Many were cut from the released game. You can still access a handful of them, however, by unconventional means. Don't expect too much, as they're not very playable, but interesting to see no less. While many PS2 deathmatch maps were cut, there were numerous level cuts from the campaign as well. Many areas from these cut levels were actually pulled out and used elsewhere in the game, but regardless, there's a lot we never got to see. Before I get into those, remember the lost levels that you could switch to in the level select screen? This idea was implemented later in development. Initially, they were all part of the base game. This explains why some levels in the final game don't connect seamlessly. It was once implied by an ex-developer that these levels weren't polished enough for the main campaign. Personally though, I find them to be pretty much on par with it. The Praetorian Camp level once served as the introduction for the Jeep, and vehicles as a whole. It's a fitting environment, with wide open spaces that give you near total freedom. Because of its shift to the lost levels, Sam first rides the Jeep in Via Aurelia. Through the Servian Gates once had a very different introduction. The entire first chunk was eventually split off, then retitled the Tiber River, only for it all to be scrapped later on. You can still play a customized version of it, however, in MKBU's Next Encounter map pack for Classic. One scrapped enemy I didn't mention earlier, a very significant enemy mind you, was a character called Mini Sam. As far as we know, this is where the idea for the evil Sam clone came from. It bears similarity to that of the Thief enemy, which was a concept scrapped from both the classic First Encounter and Serious Sam 2. The Thief would basically steal some of your items, and you could get them back after killing it. Mini Sam would first appear in the Temple of Mars, where he would steal your newly obtained rocket launcher. Speaking of, You usually get the minigun in the Temple of Mars, but in the prototype it was actually the rocket launcher. Anyways, you would chase Mini Sam throughout the level, only to catch up with him at the end in order to reclaim your rocket launcher. The Temple of Mars is one of the levels that we know to have used the scrapped Sirius bubblegum power-up. In this case, Sam would use it to protect himself against an incoming horde of wasps. Fast forward a bit to the Toots at the Colosseum level. Not much to say about it, but after finishing, you'd be sent to the scrapped Catacombs level, an underground system that's very much akin to parts of the Under the Colosseum level. I wouldn't myself be surprised if parts of the Catacombs were repurposed for it. This is another level you can try in MKBu's Next Encounter map pack on PC. In Ancient Rome's final stage, Showdown at the Arena, the Minotaur boss was supposed to have some kind of a second phase as it drops below a fifth of its health bar. At this point, a cutscene would show it staggering back to, quote, hit the nearest flag, whatever that means. Then, Sam would be able to coax the Minotaur into a pit. You can see this pit in an early gameplay clip. In the final game, the Minotaur has no second phase. You just shoot at it until it's dead. Also, its final cutscene was once rather depressing. After the first China level, you would reach Jianku, which is another scrapped level. This took place on the Great Wall of China. In the Dunhuang Oasis level, this pagoda in the middle of the second area has an elevator with a key. The original plan was for this to be a 4-floor building, with different puzzles on each floor. The puzzles described I can compare with some other levels in the game, so I believe a few were repurposed. For instance, one of them is quite reminiscent of the entry point for the 3 Halls of Harmony. Following the Oasis, you'd find the Mountain Road and Chasm Path. These were completely cut with no footage available. I have seen their concepts remade for the Serious Sam HD Next Encounter project though. In Magao Caves, there are a few jump pads that result in the player's death. The design doc suggests that there were once nearby dragon heads that would push out giant gusts of wind. If Sam positioned himself correctly, the jump pads would launch Sam to the other side. In the final game, there's no reason to use them. Unfortunately, however, you still can. The Magao Caves that we know once ended with a rocky arch taking you to the end of the level. This arch would collapse midway, and Sam would have to jump to the cliff below. Instead, this whole scenario was replaced with a teleporter that takes you to the exit. I have a theory regarding Magao Caves. Remember that one area towards the end with numerous holes protected by Gandhi sorcerers? I think this was initially a giant nest for wasps, and the sorcerers replaced them. Not only would it be fitting for this seemingly random idea, the following Cave of the Wicker Man level, originally called the Caverns, was once a giant wasp nest. Notice these honeycombs everywhere? Oh, to clarify, most wasps don't actually produce honey, but a few species can? So wait, if the entire idea behind this The Caverns level was repurposed, yet a bunch of other cool levels just ended up being scrapped, why save this level and create a whole new Wicker Man enemy for it? The answer is, I don't know. This isn't even a lost level, it's in the main campaign. Some things about this game's development are confusing. Anyways, this chapter would have ended with Sam jumping onto a minecart track. It would then transition into a scrap level called the Crystal Mines. Here, Sam would be fighting monsters on adjacent minecarts. My estimate is it would take about 5 minutes to complete, so a pretty short level overall. Andrew sent me some videos, which show a pretty empty stage with a lot of lava. No minecart yet in either of the builds he had on hand. Following this was another scrapped level, the Emperor's Highway. From this footage that we have, it seems to have been a rather big but perhaps uneventful level. It's more or less a straight path to the end, with monster ambushes in between. Pretty cool skybox though. The design document implies that before Sam enters the Silk Road level, he's promised a serious tank, but teleports from the wrong hangar and is left with the Harvester instead. I don't know what the point of that was. They don't mention the existence of a tank beyond that. The Imperial Garden level once had a variety of differences, including a pagoda house that contained a shoulder-mounted weapon called the Cruise Missile Launcher. It was essentially a predecessor to the cannon. The Cruise Missile Launcher fired heavily explosive warheads at a target, with a magazine capacity of 5. There were 2 firing modes, Standard, which fires straight shots, and Guided, which allows the player to manually fly a missile towards a target. The player can't control Sam while doing so. The first level of the Atlantis chapter is a chilly reception. After this, you are meant to visit the Ice Flows level, which was completely cut. All we know is that it involved icebergs. Andrew's builds couldn't get the level to load, so it might not have been worked on much. The following scrapped level, Isle of Atlantis, would follow up Ice Flows. It mentions that Sam would enter this level by first getting off his hoverboat, so it's assumed that the hoverboat would have been used to navigate between icebergs in said level. That Isle of Atlantis level takes place in the center of a volcanic crater. It would have been almost tropical, covered with lush green vegetation. There would be, quote, unsure footing, and occasional rocks falling to watch out for, according to the design document. In the Guardian Gates, at one point you had to scale the statues. Instead, in the final game, you scale a completely different area, then travel to the head of a statue. In concept art, you can see what could very well be the origin of these statues, looking more akin to the Atlantean enemies than the final counterpart. The Hall of Translation used to have the player swimming through floating bubbles of water, or so says the design document. No idea whether this was just a written idea or something they had actually implemented into the game at any point, but my guess is this might have been where you would use that scuba gear. Next is the cut Hall of Sleep level, with no pictures or info. It's quite possible this was just an earlier version of the Hall of Translation, but there's no way to know for sure. In the Corridors of Power, Sam would have to solve some kind of puzzle to enter the throne room. As Sam walks in, the room would begin to shudder. Natrixa realizes that this structure is in fact a huge Syrian spacecraft. A cutscene would play, showing the craft tearing free of the palace, ripping out of the seabed, then soaring into the atmosphere. Lastly, the Syrian mothership level was at one point to incorporate unusual gravity, but the final version of the game is flat. And that's it. Unfortunately, we don't have any documents that outline the original ending of the game. Many levels had design changes that I didn't go over. Most of what we have for those are just text descriptions. For the most part, they're puzzles the player would have to complete. Some just as, if not wackier than the second encounters. I tend to like Next Encounter's existing gimmicks more than the drawn-out nonsense found in Second Encounter, so they might have been alright, but I trust their judgment in leaving them out. Something interesting to note is that they had a few multiplayer modes planned that didn't make the cut. The developers once spoke out to say that the removal of these features was painful to them. The more I learn about Next Encounter's development, the more it seems like it was a total throw shit at the wall and see what sticks experiment. I feel that in the end, however, it worked out quite well. I can't speak for their sale records, but Next Encounter has a good reputation today among Serious Sam fans. I would be lying to say it's universally praised. It has been a bit divisive among purists, but those looking for a great, fast-paced and cartoony shooter experience would be missing out by not giving Next Encounter a try. Despite having a fair amount of time in development, both Serious Sam Next Encounter and Serious Sam Advance were released on the exact same day. My belief is that both games might have been struggling to pull everything together by the end. It would explain Next Encounter's dramatic shift in plot. Regarding Serious Sam Advance, well, just watch my video about that for more insight. What I can personally confirm is that the Next Encounter team crunched 80+ hour work weeks for months on end to get it finished, as said previously by one of the game directors, James Lane. I hope that someday a company like Night Dive would take a look at giving Next Encounter a proper PC release. That being said, I don't know what the licensing looks like for this one, as it's not quite a Crow Team game, nor entirely a Climax game. The rumor is that Take-Two still has some connection with it, and we all know how hostile Take-Two is with their IPs. At the very least, there's a mouse injector tool for the Dolphin emulator if you'd like to play it more akin to a traditional Serious Sam game. Although, I've found it makes the game significantly easier, so that's another thing to think about if it's ever brought over to PC. Thanks for watching, everyone! I know this video took a while to get out. Surely you can understand why, though. There is so much to talk about when it comes to Next Encounter's development. Which is funny because just a few years ago we knew basically nothing about it. Anyways, I hope to see you all in the next video. Bye for now!